I was the secret 11th passenger on the Mary Celeste. I saw everything. The silence. That was the worst part. One moment, the ship was alive. The groan of timber, the snap of sails, the low chatter of the German crew, the happy laugh of a little girl. The next, nothing. Just a strange, low hum that seemed to rise from the sea itself. A sound that vibrated right through your bones. My name is Thomas. You won't find my name on any manifest or in any official record, but I was there. I was the secret 11th passenger on the brigantine Mary Celeste. I saw it all. And I am the only one who knows what really happened to the 10 souls who vanished from her decks in the winter of 1872. Everyone has a theory. Pirates, mutiny, a freak wave, an explosion that never happened. They talk about the 9 empty barrels of alcohol and the pump someone took apart. They whisper about drunken rampages and murder, but they're all wrong. I was there when the sea started to glow. I was there when the water began to sing. And I watched as Captain Briggs, his family, and his crew, with perfectly calm faces, stepped into their lifeboat and rowed not away from danger, but towards a beautiful, terrible light. They didn't flee the ship. They were called away.
Chapter 1. The Stowaway's Story.
My story doesn't start on the ocean. It starts in the filth of New York City's waterfront. I was 12, an orphan with nothing but the rags on my back and a fire in my belly. I spent my days dodging through crowds and my nights huddled in alleys, dreaming of any life that wasn't cold cobblestone. The sea was my only way out. I'd spend hours on the piers, watching the great ships come and go, their masts like a forest of dead trees against the gray sky. I learned their rhythms, when the longshoremen took their breaks, the small windows of time when a boy could slip past unseen. The Mary Celeste caught my eye the second she docked at Pier 50. She wasn't the biggest ship, but there was a grace to her. A 282-ton brigantine that looked both tough and fast. For days, I watched them load her cargo, 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol, bound for Genoa, Italy. A long voyage, far from New York. This was my chance. I knew the risks, but another winter on the streets? That was a far scarier thought. On a damp, gray morning, November 7th, 1872, I made my move. In the chaos before departure, with crates swinging and men shouting, I slipped up the gangplank, just another shadow among shadows. My heart hammered against my ribs. I found my way down into the dark, cavernous hold, the air thick with the smell of pine tar, salt, and the sharp tang of alcohol. I squeezed into a tiny gap between a stack of barrels and the cold, damp hull. This was my world now. From my hiding place, I became a ghost, watching life on the ship. When it was quiet, I'd sneak out to find water or steal a piece of hardtack from the galley. It was on these little trips that I started to get to know them. Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs was the heart of the ship. I'd see him on deck, a tall man in his 30s with a beard and a stern but not unkind face. He was a deeply religious man. Sometimes I could hear him through the deck boards, his voice a low, steady rumble as he read from the Bible. He ran a tight ship, but he was fair, and the crew respected him for it. His wife Sarah was a gentle soul, and her presence seemed to soften the ship's hard edges. I'd catch glimpses of her on deck, her skirts whipping in the wind. But the real light of the ship was their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia. Her laughter was like music. I'd see her toddling around, chasing a piece of rope, her mother always near. They were a family, making this ship a home, and watching them from the shadows, I felt a loneliness so deep it ached. The crew was mostly quiet, hard-working German sailors. The first mate, Albert Richardson, was a capable man who carried out the captain's orders with precision. I learned the others' names by listening: Andrew Gilling, the second mate, and the seamen Volkert and Boy Lorenzen, Arian Martins, and Gottlieb Gautschaw. They were a somber bunch, often smoking their pipes in silence. But there was no hint of mutiny, none of the discontent the men at the inquiry would later look so hard for. They were just good sailors on a normal trip. For the first couple of weeks, the weather was rough. The Atlantic was angry. Down in the hold, I was tossed around like a rag doll, sick and bruised. It was then I noticed something strange. 9 of the barrels near me felt different. They were lighter, and when the ship rolled, they didn't make that sloshing sound. I'd later learn they were made of red oak, a wood more porous than the others, and had likely been leaking their volatile fumes. A faint vapor hung in the air, a detail that would fuel theories for 100 years, but a detail I knew was just a tiny piece of a much stranger puzzle. My world was shadows and stolen food, and the rhythm of the ship above. I was a secret, drifting across the ocean, completely unaware that I was about to be the only witness to one of history's greatest mysteries. The normal world was about to end.
Chapter 2. The Strange Events.
Things started to change when the weather broke. The ocean calmed, its surface turning to a rolling sheet of deep blue. A kind of peace settled over the Mary Celeste. But it was a fragile peace, and it didn't last. It was broken by a sound. It started as a low hum, so faint I almost missed it. At first I figured it was just the ship groaning, or wind in the rigging. But this was different. It was a constant, deep note that seemed to vibrate up through the hull into my teeth. Down in the hold, it was stronger, a thrumming that felt like we were sailing over some giant, sleeping creature. The crew felt it too. I saw them stop their work, tilting their heads, trying to place the sound. They'd look at the sea, the sky, anywhere, their faces confused. I saw Captain Briggs on the quarterdeck, his spyglass pointed not at the horizon, but at the water right next to the ship, a deeply troubled look on his face. The hum was an unwelcome passenger, and it got louder every day. Then came the light. A few nights after the humming started, I peeked out from a hatch cover. The moon was a sliver, so the sea should have been pitch black. It wasn't. The water all around the ship was glowing. This wasn't the sparkle of bioluminescence I'd seen in the harbor. It was a steady, milky green-blue light that pulsed from the depths. It was beautiful, but a chilling kind of beautiful. The ship felt like it was sailing through a liquid sky. I watched the crew gather at the rails, their faces bathed in that eerie glow. They weren't scared, they were mesmerized. They just stood there, staring down into the water, their usual quiet work forgotten. Captain Briggs and Sarah were there too, holding little Sophia tightly. They stared into the glowing sea as if they were waiting for something. The last log entry was made on the morning of November 25th, noting the ship's position near the Azores. After that, the official record stopped. But the real story was just beginning. The hum grew louder, the light grew brighter, and then the song began. It wasn't a human voice. It was a chorus of pure crystal notes that rode on top of the hum. It was the most beautiful and heartbreaking sound I had ever heard. It sang of wide open spaces, of peaceful depths, of a home I'd never known but suddenly yearned for. It was a song of release, a promise of an end to all struggle, all pain. Even in my hiding spot, it pulled at me. I felt this overwhelming urge to leave the dark hold, to walk into the light, to find the source of that impossible music. But my fear, the instinct of a boy who'd only survived by hiding, kept me frozen. That terror was my anchor. I watched the others through a crack in the hatch. The song had them completely, all 10 of them. Their faces, lit by that unearthly glow, weren't filled with panic. They were serene, peaceful. It was the look of people who had found what they were searching for. The German sailors, Captain Briggs, his wife Sarah, even little Sophia, who wasn't crying but staring wide-eyed into the light. They were captivated. The Mary Celeste was no longer a merchant ship. It had become an altar. And I, the boy in the shadows, was the only one left to watch.
Chapter 3. The Departure.
The end came with an eerie, unnatural calmness. There was no panic, no shouting, none of the chaos you'd expect. What I saw wasn't a crew abandoning a sinking ship. It was a quiet procession, like they were answering a call they had been waiting for. The song was now a symphony, making the very air vibrate. The glow from the ocean was so bright, it cast sharp shadows across the deck. Captain Briggs turned from the rail, his face calm, and walked to his cabin. He came back out, not with charts or logbooks, but with his sextant and chronometer. He looked like a navigator about to take a reading, not a man fleeing for his life. He handed them to his first mate, Albert Richardson, who took them with a solemn nod. Then, the captain went back and returned with his wife and daughter. Sarah Briggs held Sophia, her face tilted towards the glowing sea, a look of happy, peaceful acceptance on her face. Little Sophia was silent, her small hand reaching out as if to touch the light. The crew worked with a quiet, dreamlike efficiency to lower the ship's single lifeboat. Their movements were fluid, unhurried. They worked like men in a dream, their actions guided by the irresistible music. I saw one of them, I think it was Boy Lorenzen, pause and look up at the mast, as if some old sailor's habit briefly broke through. But then the song pulled his attention back. They were leaving everything, their pipes, their money, their clothes, and their sea chests. None of it mattered anymore. Captain Briggs had them secure a long tow line from the Mary Celeste to the lifeboat. This is the detail that would confuse everyone for a century. Why would you tie yourself to a ship you thought was about to sink or explode? The answer is simple. They weren't afraid of the Mary Celeste. They weren't fleeing it. They were using it as an anchor, a guide rope to wherever they were going. With the lifeboat in the water, they boarded. The crew went first, then Sarah, who passed Sophia down to her husband. Captain Briggs was the last to leave his ship. He stood for a moment, gave the vessel one last long look, and then climbed into the boat. From my hiding spot, I watched them row, not frantically away, but slowly, deliberately, towards the brightest patch of light a few hundred yards off the port bow. The tow line pulled taut. They were all facing the light, their backs to me. The song swelled, hitting a final piercing note of pure joy, and as it did, the light on the water pulsed, once, twice, and then flared into a brilliance that was almost blinding. For a split second, the lifeboat and its 10 passengers were silhouetted against that impossible light. And then, they were gone. The light, the song, the boat vanished. The tow line, now tied to nothing, snapped back and hit the water with a soft splash. Then, silence. A deep, deafening silence. The humming stopped. The water was black again. The only sounds left were the gentle lapping of waves against the hull and the frantic, terrified beating of my own heart. I was alone. Utterly alone on a ghost ship in the middle of the Atlantic. The theories you've heard can't explain what I saw. If you find this story as haunting as I do, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. What do you think that light was? Let me know in the comments. Chapter 4. Alone on the Ghost Ship. The silence that came after was a physical thing. It pressed in on me, heavier than any storm. I don't know how long I stayed in my hiding spot. Time had lost all meaning. My mind just kept replaying it. 10 people dissolving into light and sound. Finally, driven by a desperate loneliness, I crept out of the hold. The deck was eerily empty. The sails were still partially set, flapping in the breeze. The frayed end of the tow line dangled over the side, trailing in the dark water like a severed nerve. I went to the captain's cabin. The door was ajar. Inside, everything was in perfect order. His Bible lay open on a table. Sarah's sewing basket sat on a chair, a needle still threaded. Under the captain's bed, his sword was in its sheath, untouched. There was no sign of violence. Their lives were all here, just left behind. In the galley, a pot of coffee sat cold on the stove. There was enough food and water on that ship for 6 months. This wasn't a crew that was starving. I walked the length of the ship, a 12-year-old boy on a vessel of ghosts. I saw the crew's quarters, their pipes resting on tables, their sea chests full. On the deck, I found the ship's pump had been taken apart, its pieces laid out neatly, as if someone started a repair and just forgot. This, and the 3.5 feet of water in the hold, would later be called proof that the crew thought the ship was sinking. But I knew better. That amount of water wasn't critical, and the calm way they left showed they weren't panicking. They had time. They just chose not to use it. Those 10 days alone were the longest of my life. During the day, the sun beat down on an empty deck. At night, every creak of timber sent a jolt of fear through me. I was haunted by the memory of the song. I found myself straining to hear it again, half in terror, half in a strange, lonely pit. But it was gone. I survived on biscuits and fresh water from the casks. I was too small to manage the sails or steer, so the Mary Celeste just drifted, a wounded animal with no master. On the 10th day, December 4th by my count, I saw it. Another ship on the horizon. Hope, so strong it hurt, surged through me. I ran onto the deck, waving my arms and shouting until my throat was raw. The ship, the Canadian brigantine De Gratia, saw me.
Do you see it?
I watched as they lowered a boat and rowed over.
It's just drifting.
When they climbed aboard, their faces were a mask of confusion. They saw a ship that was perfectly fine, yet totally deserted, except for one terrified, half-starved boy. My ordeal was over, but in many ways, it was just beginning.
Chapter 5. The Unbelieved Witness.
The crew of the De Gratia, led by Captain David Morehouse, was baffled. He knew Captain Briggs. They were friends who had even dined together in New York before setting sail. They found a seaworthy ship, in almost full cargo, and no signs of a struggle. And then they found me. They sailed the Mary Celeste to Gibraltar, where a court was convened to investigate. The inquiry was led by the Attorney General, a man named Frederick Solly Flood. A historian later described him as a man whose arrogance and pomposity were inversely proportional to his IQ. And that about sums it up. Solly Flood immediately decided the De Gratia's crew had murdered everyone for the salvage money. And then there was me, the impossible witness. I stood before the court, a scared kid in borrowed clothes, and I tried to tell them what I saw. I told them about the humming. I described the glowing sea and the beautiful, irresistible song. I told them how Captain Briggs and his crew had calmly rowed towards the light and simply vanished. Solly Flood didn't buy a word of it. A glowing sea? A singing ocean? Just a boy's fantasy, he said, brought on by trauma. He saw me as a liar, coached by Captain Morehouse's crew. He kept asking me,
Where were you on
they
the night
drunk?
of the incident?
No, I said. The cargo was poisonous
home, sir.
industrial alcohol, and Captain Briggs didn't drink. Was it a mutiny? No, They were a good crew. Pirates? No, nothing was stolen. My story was useless to him because it didn't fit his simple tale of murder and greed. He preferred his version, focusing on a few spots on the deck he claimed were blood. They weren't, and some nicks on the rail he thought were from an axe. He was obsessed with the 9 empty barrels and a fantasy of a drunken massacre. My truth was just too strange for his mind. I was dismissed as a traumatized child, and my story was erased from the record. The court never found any proof of foul play, but Solly Flood's suspicion stuck. The crew of the Dei Gratia received only a fraction of the salvage money they deserved. The official verdict was, well, there was no verdict. The fate of the 10 souls aboard the Mary Celeste was officially declared an unsolvable mystery. Years later, the story took on a life of its own, especially after Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a fictional version. He called the ship the Mary Celeste, and his story of murder became more famous than the facts. People talked about sea monsters, ghost pirates, aliens. The theory about the leaking alcohol fumes causing a panic became the most popular. It's plausible, it's logical, but it's wrong. They didn't panic, they weren't lost, they were found.
What do you think happened to the crew of the Mary Celeste? What was the source of that light? Share your theories below. And if you want to explore more of history's great unknowns, make sure to subscribe. Thank you for listening.